Awesome. Okay. Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Get Jashed. Today I have with me Derek Morgan. Derek has worked in sales, consulting, business development and marketing for over 30 years and is currently positioned at Nexon Asia Pacific. Derek is also founder of the USA Sports Scholarship.com. It's an online digital education platform to help student athletes and their parents navigate the challenges of international student athletes seeking sports scholarships to colleges in the USA, which I imagine would be really helpful. So thank you so much for your time today, Derek, for joining me.
Thanks for having me on, Jess. It's a privilege.
My pleasure. So I'm curious about, because I've spoken a lot, I come from a marketing background myself, marketing, communications, public relations, not specifically sales and business development, but I have shared and mused a lot about how communication plays a role in those things beyond just networking skills as such. So I'm curious about how your work in sales and biz dev has taught you about communicating and connecting specifically for you.
Yeah, well, I guess I've had the privilege and the challenge of changing industries a number of times over those 30 years. Thanks for pointing out my age, Jess. No, but it's been interesting, it's been challenging, it's been fun. So from a communication perspective, every time you morph into a new industry, there's a whole language, there's a whole lot of acronyms, there's a whole lot of specialist information that an industry has, or a way that they communicate that you've basically got to learn and understand and then work with. And I guess that's been one of my privileges working in consultative sales, that I've been able to communicate at a very high level and maybe not get right down into the technicalities of those industries, relying on other people and communicating with other people to support me there.
Yeah, so it's about you focus more on the people rather than the industries as such in terms of how you communicate and connect.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, all business is people to people. You know, B2B is not, you may be working in a business environment, but it's still people to people. And yeah, so it's important to understand that, when you're dealing in any industry with any individuals.
Yeah, definitely. Do you feel like people tend to forget that B2B is P2P?
I think there's been a tendency for business communications and sales to probably be more transactional and less storytelling, because people communicate through stories. We have done through the centuries, and I think working in technology as well, we see it a lot. There's so much technical jargon and information in all the written correspondence that comes through, that sometimes the impactful stories that sit behind the outcomes of the technology get lost because it is a relatively technical environment. So that's probably, I think that's an area that a lot of people could focus on more, is actually getting into the storytelling side of things, particularly with complex strategies and complex information. How do you simplify it? And it's through stories and outcomes rather than the technical aspects of, most industries have their jargon. And quite often people fall into the traps of just communicating in jargon, and it's not necessarily the most effective way to go about getting an outcome.
Yeah, definitely. That makes me, I don't know if you've read any of his work or watched any of his work. Simon Sinek wrote a book called Start With Why. Yep. And he shares all about how like the brands that we all know, so like Apple versus Dell, for example, and Apple didn't sell the specifications like of the product. Apple sold the story and the why and what you could do with it, whereas Dell tried to sell the specs.
Feature. Yeah,
you can see the difference in success and growth of either company. So it just makes me think of that, and how, like, and I also talk a lot about starting with your why and checking back in with why you're doing something,
Yeah.
and in how you share that as well. So that's really good.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Okay.
Yeah. So I follow a lot of what Russell Brunson talks about from a marketing aspect, because he's a master storyteller. And one of his books, he talks about technobabble. So he quite often refers to technobabble in communication, and you lose a lot of people when you do that. So, that's the power of storytelling in a different way.
It is a good perspective, because I know that in experiences that I've had, we've had the challenges of, like, the designers, like, the back end designers who know what they're doing and they're very good at what they do, but getting it in translation from there to the customer experience in terms of explaining what they get out of it and explaining it to the customer, or on that end. And there's always been that challenge in the in-between, because there is the technobabble, which makes perfect sense to the people who know what they're talking about and who create it. And it is great because they are great at what they do, but then it's just teasing out those things to get it over to the actual, why do you want this, or why is this good, and why is this update so useful for you?
Yeah, and it's a really good point you make, because we have to deal with this from a Nexon point of view, where we deal with local government, state, federal governments, private enterprise at different levels, and we have different stakeholders in that communication process. And because we're dealing in a lot of complex technology, you actually need that blend of both, where you're delivering the strategic conceptual messages in one language to one group of stakeholders, but then that might be the CEO and the CFO that don't necessarily want the technical aspects of it. But in the same proposal, you then need to appeal to the CTO, who has and requires very much a technical understanding. So yeah, it can often be a challenge, sort of communicating in two different modalities in the one document, as an example.
Yeah, it's almost like being bilingual, but yeah, communicating like in both languages at once is a little bit of a juggling act, I think, and requires a little bit of just understanding and nuance. Yeah.
Knowing your audience.
Yeah, definitely. And connecting with them in that way, and just knowing what they need to hear or what they will want to hear, but, and presenting it in a way that they can understand and get. So before those years of experience and everything like that, what were your ideas of leadership and communication, like back in your formative years? So the first sort of understandings in your life that you had around the concept of leadership and communication, and has it changed much?
Oh, it's changed dramatically. I mean, as we go through each sort of learning curve and each experience, if we're not taking something new and learning from that, then we're bound to be repeating our mistakes of the past. So, I mean, I've always been actively involved in team sports. So you're picking up leadership skills from there in a different way, and then you go into each different job role or corporate environment that you go into, and the people that you network and mingle with, have something valuable to offer. So I guess I've been a little bit like a sponge through all that process, and just basically absorbing along the way, and then find out what's useful for you, because we all communicate in different ways. You absorb what's useful for you, and then you evolve over time. So I tend to consume a lot of information over the years, and quite regularly. So I've got a regular personal development habit of finding those half a dozen key influences in the marketplace that are delivering a really strong educational message, and then basically looking to constantly evolve from that. So yeah, it's an ongoing learning process.
I think that's really important as well. Everything is a learning opportunity. In my belief, I'll own it. Like everything is a learning opportunity, and I always get curious, which is why I asked that question about like the formative years, because sometimes people have these really defined sort of stories of something, but I always get curious in case someone sort of says one time that it's the same as what they are now, and then there's more to dive into, because it's like, well, why is it the same? Because you've had all these experiences, you've lived life, you know. And yeah, I think if we're not, there's the saying, like, if we're not growing, we're dying, right? So it's just this curiosity around how we approach our abilities to grow and to evolve and to, you know, expand our perspective. So what we once knew was correct, quote unquote, at one stage, like, we are allowed to grow and evolve and change as we learn. That's what happens.
Yeah. So I guess going back to your original question, you know, what have I observed or learnt around leadership? Probably in the last 10 years, I've observed things that were happening as a natural consequence of changing industries and going into completely new things. I actually ended up with a mentor who was a current leader in that business or organisation or whatever, teaching me, because I had such a big gap to bridge by going from completely new industries rather than through promotion within a stable industry environment. So I guess I was naturally acquiring mentors in that process without being outwardly aware of that. And then in the last 10 years, I guess I've been actively going and seeking mentors so that I can learn from other people's mistakes, learn from other people's wisdoms, and not sort of make the same mistakes that other people have done, and basically shortcut that learning process. So that's probably the biggest takeaway from leadership that I've discovered in the last 10 years.
Yeah, that's a really good takeaway as well. I wanted to touch on the sports scholarship program or assistance that you have in the USA Sports Scholarship.com. Is the creation of that, because you're the founder of that, so the creation of that, do you find that there's challenges in seeking those scholarships and that require a different way of communicating?
Yeah, it's certainly forced, well, not forced, us as parents, myself and my wife as parents, to look at the way we communicate with our kids personally, but then also challenged us to look at how do we then talk to other people's teenage kids, or engage with teenagers, get a message out to them, and also support parents in that process of having that conversation between themselves and their teenage children around what is potentially a really massive move for them to go, okay, put my hand up, I want a sports scholarship to go and live and study in the US as a 17 or 18-year-old. You know, there's some really challenging conversations that go on between parents and kids around that process. So we really took a mentor approach with our girls when they made the decision that that's what they wanted to do. And that in itself led to a whole focused support role for us as parents, talking to these teenage kids around, right, you've got this big goal that you want to do. Now we need to chunk this down into more manageable pieces. We need to run it out over a timeline, and we need to look at what you need to do over the next 4 years, because it's potentially a 4-year process. And if it's not a 4-year process, then what you needed to do in 4 years gets chunked down into a shorter time frame. So as teenagers and as parents, how do you then go, okay, there's your goal out there in the future. Now let's work backwards from there for all the things that you need to do around your academics, around your sports. What do you need to be doing on a regular basis to get those up to a level? And then how do you as a student athlete communicate with coaches overseas, because the coaches don't want to talk to the parents because they're recruiting the athlete, at least in the initial stages. So that certainly changed the way we communicated with our daughters, and the way we focused on helping support them through goal setting and the things that they wanted and how they were going about doing it. So that was probably the biggest takeaway for us in setting that sort of online service up to support other parents going through what we were going through. Because it comes back to that scenario of we fell in a hole. We thought we were doing the right thing. We were following the promoted path, and we fell in a huge amount of potholes. And it was like, well, we've learned something. Maybe that information will be of value to other parents about to go through the same challenges we went through and are still going through with our younger daughter.
Yeah, and there's a whole lot of different layers of communication even in that process, right? Like there's communication with your kids around like getting them and helping them to voice what it is they want for their lives and what goals that they have and finding what that is. And then it's the communication, it turns into more of that coaching kind of role of communicating the steps required, like, and really nutting that out. But then you're right, it does, and then it becomes about teaching communication on, like you said, about getting them comfortable with speaking to the coaches over there that they'll be working with and being taught by and learning with. So yeah, there's a lot in that, but it's really awesome. I feel like that's a really healthy way to learn how to communicate, or not learn how to, you would have already known how to, but learn that deeper level of communicating.
Yeah, look, exactly. And because it really, you have a real laser focus around something that you can have these complex conversations around with your kids, because it's a goal that they're focused on, that they're driven towards, and therefore they're more engaged in the process of this whole goal setting and discipline and focus and vision building, which sometimes, the kids are so distracted now with social media and digital and always on. And if it's not the device and Snapchat, then it's Netflix. And it's like they tend to have less opportunities to just like pull back and really use their imagination rather than external stimulus. So they have a really big goal that they're then forced to then do that vision building, and then that motivates them to go through the structured process of goal setting and that sort of thing. So yeah, it's been an interesting and powerful process for our girls.
Yeah, I really like it. Yeah, of course. Yeah, it sounds to me, and maybe this is just me, but it sounds like fun. It sounds like my idea of fun. Like, yeah, let's vision build and let's look at the steps that we can get there. So that's really, really cool. Where do you feel like, so bringing it to you, and you've touched on little areas here, but if you could sort of summarize it, where do you feel like you get communication and leadership right?
Oh, depends who you're talking to at any given point in time. I mean, I get it. I think I get it right in most times that I try to anticipate the impact that the conversation that I'm about to have with somebody, how it may or may not be received. I guess being a little bit thoughtful in your engagement in the conversation rather than just being reactive or dare I say it, self-interested or self-centered. So if you are always thinking about the outcome for the other person on the other side of the conversation, then you're going to have a better communicative experience, and you'll get what you want out of that engagement by helping that other person get what they need out of that engagement. Now, you then need to weigh up a whole range of scenarios. Do I do that particularly well at home? Not all the time. Do I do a better job of it at work? Yes. Is there big opportunities to fall over in both scenarios? Absolutely. But I think if you're generally sensitive to the other person, you're other person focused, you're going to get the best experience out of any communication piece, for yourself and for them. So not necessarily an expert at it, but it's certainly something that I've been working on consciously for some time.
I think
probably never get it right, but
yeah, I think it's a really important thing. And I want to touch on actually what you just said is we may not always get it right all the time. And I tell people, like, especially around communication and leadership, but communication in particular, because we all communicate in some way. Sometimes it's just not as effective, but there's so much fear around having like certain conversations or courageous conversations because we're afraid to screw up. And if we kind of just accept that, no, I'm not always going to get it right, then we kind of have a little bit more courage to at least try and at least step up. So, yeah.
And I think if the conversation starts out with a relationship where you know that both sides have the best of intentions, then the tolerance for mistakes is so much higher. And then the ability to work through the miscommunications, it might not necessarily be a mistake, but a miscommunication. And, I find email drives me nuts because particularly when you've got bunches of people CC'd in and some people are responsive to email and some people aren't, and there's always an opportunity for things to be misconstrued or taken out of order and context. And so that written communication, I think, is becoming more and more challenging as we start to communicate in sound bites as well. Obviously, when we're sitting here having a two-way conversation, we can establish the trust base, and we can redirect the communication in real time. Written communication, I think, is becoming more and more challenging as it's becoming more and more sound bites and more prolific.
Yeah, I find like one thing I encourage is, if there's misunderstanding, is to ask the question and say, I'm not sure I understand that. Can you please clarify this? Because this is how I am taking it, and just asking, or whatever the wording is, but just asking a question. But it's, I think there's a sense of tediousness that in message or text or like in written communication, to ask that clarification, it feels a little more tedious because especially the more soundbitey they get, the more you feel this sense of, oh no, we're just getting to the point, like this, like this, not this hurriedness, but this sense of this has to be short and prompt rather than taking the time out to create understanding if there's understanding needed.
And I think this whole Microsoft Teams approach, if there's one positive to come out of this isolation, I think it's the preparedness to go to video more. People have, they've been thrust into that process, and people are more readily visible and available. So it is quite easy to go, hang on, this written communication's just like, I'm not texting, I'm not tweeting, I'm not short messaging, I'm not emailing anymore. I'm just going to click and video and we can have this type of conversation. And I think that's been one of the really big positives, out of a difficult scenario. I think the adoption of this type of technology and this type of face-to-face engagement is going to be increased dramatically moving forward. I know we're doing a lot more video chats internally, whereas previously we'd pick up the phone.
Yeah.
We had this technology available to us, but now we're getting more face-to-face interaction.
That's what I'm noticing, is there's just a different kind of willingness to connect now than there was before. So it's super helpful and super important, I think, especially right now. But I have one last question for you. It's a two-parter. One,
that would be two questions.
I like to call them last question A and last question B, but part A is, where do you feel like there's room for improvement needed for yourself?
From a communication perspective.
Yeah, communication and or leadership. I feel like they're kind of intertwined, but yeah, it depends on what perspective you have.
From a communication perspective, I need to become a better storyteller.
Mm-hmm.
And I need to be more prolific in the amount of content that I produce. That can sometimes be a challenge for a lot of people. So, being consistent around your personal brand. So, I do have a public profile. It's not public. It's not as public as it should be. And I think that goes for a lot of people could do more around their personal brand. And obviously depends on your roles, but you have an internal personal brand and you have an external personal brand. And so in organization or in your role, or maybe external, but if you do have a business development, public relations, sales type of role, then building your personal brand and your personal profile, it's never been easier. But doing it consistently, for a lot of people, myself included, I'm not consistent at it. That's probably where I need to improve in my communication, is developing that personal brand and then exposing that out into the marketplace more consistently.
And I think you might have answered part B in that, is, where do you feel like there's room for improvement in like your industry or in the industry around you? Do you think that is about the personal branding, or is there something else?
No, I think we're in a very I work in a very technical, I'm a non-technical person working in a very technical industry. So, my observations as an industry is that we are a very technobabble type of an industry. It's very product focused, but at the end of the day, the products are the products, and it's not the technology itself that is. The technology is an enabler. And it enables an outcome, or it enables a solution. And I think we need to be talking more about telling more stories about solutions and ideas and outcomes and vision building, as opposed to being probably so technically focused. I don't know if that answers your question, but
It does. Yeah, definitely. It's talking about the vision. It goes back to what we spoke about at the beginning, is what's the why this matters? Like, what's the why of what the point to this, what's the point, rather than what it is.
People are essentially looking for opportunities, or they're looking for a solution to a problem. The underlying tool that gets used to deliver that's probably the secondary piece. Yes, it needs to be done efficiently, effectively, and cost effectively, but really it's the opportunity that's created, or the problem that's solved, that is of the primary importance. So I think that's where the industry can do a lot to make things easier on clients, tell better stories.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Derek. I really, really appreciate you coming on and sharing some of your insights and your experience and your wisdom there, which is the whole point of this series anyway, is just to create those conversations and share the perspectives, because there can be more than one way to do things. So we need to stop limiting ourselves to saying we can't, and just look at the ways in which we can. So
how can we? Yeah. And thanks, Jess. I appreciate the platform of helping me build my personal brand.
You're welcome. See, it all worked out.
Thanks, Jess.